They always tell you to stay calm and take the high road. But how can you stay quiet when someone tries to destroy your biggest joy? I was sitting at a quiet restaurant with my husband, Gavin, holding my hand under the white tablecloth while we waited to share the happiest news of our lives with my mother-in-law, Audrey. Gavin pulled a small blue envelope from his jacket, placed the very first doctor picture of our baby right in the middle of the table, and said with a huge smile that they were going to be grandparents, expecting tears of joy or a warm hug. Instead, the whole table went dead silent as my mother-in-law ignored the baby picture completely, glared straight at me with eyes full of cold fear, and stood up in the middle of that crowded room, pointing her finger at my face and screaming so loudly that every single person stopped eating to watch. "You can't have that baby. You'd be a terrible mother, and my son deserves so much better than you." My husband gasped in absolute shock, and my mother-in-law really thought I would break down, cry, and run out the door. But she had no idea that I work with numbers and legal facts every single day. And that exact humiliating moment didn't destroy me. It was the exact moment I decided to stand my ground, stay completely calm, and expose every single dirty secret her family had been hiding for years. After my mother-in-law finished screaming, the quiet in that restaurant felt heavier than her words, with every waiter and customer staring right at our table like we were a reality TV show. My husband pulled on my mother-in-law's sleeve, his face completely pale as he begged her in a harsh whisper to sit down and stop making a scene, but she just wiped her mouth with her napkin, glared down at us, and snapped that she was leaving because she couldn't stand looking at a woman who was trying to ruin her family. My father-in-law quietly slid out of his booth, threw a $50 bill onto the table without looking either of us in the eye, and followed my mother-in-law out the double glass doors, leaving the small blue envelope with our baby's ultrasound picture sitting completely forgotten next to the half-eaten bread basket. My husband just stared at the empty chairs across from us, his jaw tight and his hands shaking so violently that he couldn't even pick up his water glass, repeating over and over that he was so sorry and that he had no idea why his mother would act so crazy over something that was supposed to bring us so much happiness. I reached across the table, picked up the baby picture, slid it back into my handbag, and told my husband very calmly that we were going home, because even though my heart was pounding against my ribs, my auditor mind was already turning over a very specific question. Why would a wealthy, proud woman be genuinely terrified, not just angry, about her own son having a child? The drive back to our apartment was completely silent, except for the quiet hum of the tires on the highway and the rain starting to hit the windshield. My husband kept one hand tight on the steering wheel while his other hand reached over to grip mine, his knuckles white, endlessly apologizing for what my mother-in-law had done at the restaurant. When we finally walked into our quiet living room, my husband collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, utterly broken by the way his own family had treated us on the night we were supposed to be celebrating. I sat down beside him, pulled his hands away from his face, and looked him straight in the eyes, telling him that we were not going to cry or beg for an apology from anyone. I reminded him that I work as a senior financial auditor every single day, which means my entire career is built on finding hidden patterns and noticing when people act out of fear rather than anger. I told my husband that my mother-in-law's reaction at the dinner wasn't just a bitter woman throwing a random tantrum. Her eyes were filled with absolute panic the moment she saw that ultrasound photo. I looked at my husband very calmly and asked him a simple question that made him freeze in place. Why would a woman who claims to love her family so much be completely horrified at the thought of her son having an heir, unless our baby's arrival meant losing something huge that she had been secretly hiding for years? My husband stared at me in total confusion, shaking his head, and saying that his family had always been completely open about their money, even if his mother was stubborn and overly controlling. He reminded me that his grandfather had set up a major family trust fund decades ago, a multi-million-dollar estate meant to support his parents himself and any future grandchildren down the line. As he spoke, something in my auditor brain clicked into place, and I asked him when was the last time he actually sat down and looked at the official legal paperwork for that trust. My husband rubbed the back of his neck, admitting that he hadn't checked a single statement in over 5 years because his mother always handled the paperwork with their family lawyer, insisting that her children didn't need to stress over financial details. I stood up from the couch, walked over to our home office desk, and brought back a clean legal pad and a pen, sitting right across from him with a look of pure determination. I told my husband that if we were going to bring a baby into this world, we needed absolute certainty about our financial future, and that tomorrow morning, he was going to exercise his full legal rights as a named beneficiary to request every single bank statement, tax filing, and trust document from the past 10 years. My husband looked at the legal pad, then at me, and though he was still heartbroken by his mother's cruelty, he slowly nodded his head, realizing that the quiet, terrified look in his mother's eyes at the restaurant was about to lead us straight to a secret she had been guarding with her life. Early the next morning, before the sun even came up, my husband sat at the kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee while I opened my laptop to draft a formal, legally binding record request directly to the trust's managing bank. My husband was nervously asking if his mother would find out that we were asking for the statements, but I gently explained to him that as a primary named beneficiary, he had every legal right to inspect those documents without needing anyone's permission. I hit send on the email, attaching his electronic signature, and within just 3 hours, the bank's compliance officer sent back a massive digital folder containing 6 years of detailed transaction histories and audited balance sheets. I pulled up my financial auditing software, laid 2 monitors side by side on our desk, and began line by line cross-referencing every single withdrawal against the original trust bylaws that my husband's grandfather had written 40 years ago. It took me less than 45 minutes to spot the massive red flag buried deep inside the monthly summaries. Starting almost 4 years ago, a steady stream of $25,000 was being pulled out of the main investment portfolio every single month under the label of property management fees. I looked up from my screen, called my husband over to stand behind my chair, and pointed directly at the recurring wire transfers that all ended up in a private corporate account that didn't belong to the trust, but was owned entirely by my mother-in-law. My husband leaned over my shoulder, staring at the screen as his eyes traced the long list of $25,000 transfers that added up to nearly $2 million, stripped straight out of his grandfather's trust. He kept shaking his head, trying to make excuses, asking if maybe his mother was using that money to pay off taxes or cover property maintenance for the family estate like she always claimed. I didn't argue with him. Instead, I simply logged into the public county property records and pulled up the deed for that private corporate account, showing him that the address listed wasn't a commercial building or a trust property at all, but a luxurious waterfront vacation home 3 states away that my mother-in-law had bought entirely in her own private name. The room felt completely cold as the truth finally sank in for my husband, watching his own mother's name on a title deed, funded entirely by money she had quietly stolen from his future. I looked up at him calmly and showed him the most crucial clause written in his grandfather's original trust agreement. A strict rule stating that the moment a primary beneficiary had a child of their own, full managerial control of the trust would instantly transfer away from the parents and directly to an independent bank officer. That was the moment everything made complete sense. My mother-in-law wasn't angry about a baby. She was terrified out of her mind because my pregnancy meant an automatic, mandatory financial audit that would expose her massive illegal transfers and strip away her secret cash flow forever. My husband stared at that property deed on my screen for what felt like a solid 5 minutes, his face going completely blank as the illusion of his loving family completely shattered around him. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, his phone on the desk started buzzing loudly, lighting up with my mother-in-law's name, followed immediately by a series of frantic text messages demanding to know why the bank had notified her of a beneficiary document request. I told my husband not to answer the call or reply to a single text, because in a situation like this, any emotional argument would only give her a chance to hide her paper trail or destroy evidence. Instead, I picked up my phone, opened my social media app, and almost dropped it when I saw that a distant cousin who had been at the restaurant last night had recorded a video of my mother-in-law's wild screaming scene and posted it online, where it was already getting thousands of views and nasty comments. The public humiliation that my mother-in-law had tried to inflict on me was now blowing up in her own face. But while the internet was laughing at the petty family drama, I knew the real story was way bigger than a viral dinner fight. I closed the app, looked at my husband's pale face, and told him that we weren't going to get drawn into a messy social media war or a yelling match on the phone. We were going to take these audited bank statements straight to a top estate lawyer and let the cold, hard law handle my mother-in-law. By 10 o'clock that morning, we were sitting in a quiet, glass-walled conference room on the 20th floor of a law firm downtown, waiting to meet with an estate lawyer named Marcus Vance. My husband sat next to me with his hands folded in his lap, looking like a ghost, while I laid out 3 organized color-coded binders filled with printed bank statements, tax records, and the original trust rules. When Mr. Vance walked in, he gave us a polite smile, but as soon as he opened the first binder and began scanning my audited summary of the monthly wire transfers, his professional expression turned completely serious. He pulled out a red pen, marking the unauthorized property purchases and matching them against the legal duties my mother-in-law had broken as a trustee. He looked up at my husband and explained in a very clear, matter-of-fact tone that this wasn't just a bitter family disagreement over an inheritance. This was outright grand larceny and a clear breach of fiduciary duty under state law. Mr. Vance told us that because my husband was an adult beneficiary and we were expecting a child, we had more than enough legal ground to immediately freeze all trust assets and demand a full judicial audit of every single dollar my mother-in-law had touched over the past decade. Hearing a top lawyer confirm every single thing I had found made my husband sit up a little straighter, and for the first time since that horrible dinner, the look of helplessness in his eyes turned into a steady, quiet resolve. Before we even left Mr. Vance's office, the legal proceedings had begun to quietly unfold, but inside the room, there was no feeling of triumph or loud celebration, only a heavy, settling silence. The temporary hold on the family accounts was filed without spectacle, handled entirely through proper legal channels to protect what belonged to Gavin's future. Sitting in a quiet diner down the street afterwards, my husband stared into his warm coffee cup, his eyes reflecting a deep, unbearable sorrow. When his mother called his phone minutes later, her voice wasn't just angry. It was laced with the raw panic of someone who realized her control was slipping away. She demanded to know why her access was questioned, trying to frame years of silent manipulation as maternal guidance. I gently placed my hand over Gavin's trembling fingers, taking the phone to speak with calm, steady composure, telling her softly that this was never about hurting her, but about truth, accountability, and protecting our unborn child from a cycle of guilt. On the other end of the line, Audrey went quiet, the sudden absence of her voice heavier than any shouting match could ever be. For the first time, she had no scripted line, no emotional leverage to turn Gavin against me or make him feel small. Gavin took the phone back, looking at me with a clarity I had waited years to see in his eyes. His voice didn't shake with rage. Instead, it carried the gentle, immovable weight of a man choosing his own family. He told his mother that while he loved her, he could no longer allow fear and control to rule his life, and that he needed complete space until she could look at her own actions honestly. As he ended the call, he didn't slam the phone down. He set it on the table with a long, soft breath, and the silence between us in that booth became the first moment of genuine peace we had shared since learning we were going to be parents. The following days brought no dramatic courtroom battles or sensational showdowns, just the slow, quiet process of forensic accountants reviewing the trust's history. With every paper trail that came to light, it became clear how Audrey's actions had stemmed from a deep, unspoken insecurity, a fear of being forgotten as her son grew up and started a life of his own. When her lawyer presented a quiet settlement offer, agreeing to step down as trustee and return the assets to avoid a drawn-out dispute, Gavin sat with the documents for hours. He didn't look for revenge or restitution beyond what was necessary to secure our child's future, signing the papers with a quiet dignity and agreeing to set firm, respectful boundaries that kept our home safe while leaving the door open for internal healing on her end, far away from our daily lives. 6 months later, the morning light filtered softly through the nursery curtains, casting warm golden rays across our daughter's crib. The trust was now under the care of a quiet, neutral bank officer, completely removed from family tension and set aside strictly for our children's education. Sitting on the rocking chair with a cup of chamomile tea while Gavin gently swayed our sleeping baby girl, the quiet in our house felt almost sacred, with no hidden messages to decode or lingering dread about the next family gathering. We realized that standing firm in a storm isn't about raising your voice or proving a point to the world. It is about protecting the quiet spaces where love, trust, and genuine peace are allowed to grow. On our daughter Lily's first birthday, we gathered in our small backyard with a few close friends who had supported us through the quietest, hardest months of our lives. Watching Gavin lift Lily onto his shoulders, his laugh clear and completely unburdened, I saw the man he was always meant to be when freed from the shadow of guilt. Word had reached us through a distant family relative that Audrey had moved to a smaller town, living a quiet, reflective life away from the high society circles she used to chase, leaving no bitterness in my heart, only a quiet hope that she, too, would eventually find peace with herself. I pulled the original, worn ultrasound photo from my journal, looking at the tiny image that had started our journey to freedom, and softly tucked it into Lily's baby book. 2 years passed in a sweet, rhythmic stillness as Gavin opened a modest landscape design studio, building a modest life with his own hands and a small, fully transparent loan from the restructured trust. One autumn evening, as we walked through a neighborhood park watching Lily run through piles of crisp orange leaves, Gavin stopped on a wooden bridge, holding my hand warmly against the cool breeze. With a soft, knowing smile, he slipped a familiar white envelope into my jacket pocket, containing a new ultrasound scan, our second child. There was no anxiety this time, no fear of how the news would be received or manipulated, as we held each other under the falling leaves, knowing our growing family was rooted in honesty so deep that no old shadow could ever touch us again. By the time our son, Leo, took his first clumsy steps, our home had become an anchor of stability for our children. One afternoon, while filing old household papers, Gavin found a delicate letter in the mail from an estate planning attorney in another town. A soft, tentative attempt from Audrey to express her regrets as her health gently declined. Gavin sat at his wooden desk for a long time, holding the paper, processing the quiet grief of what could have been, while I sat beside him, bringing 2 cups of tea and sharing the silence. After a long moment, Gavin folded the letter back, placing it inside a memory chest, recognizing that while forgiveness was already given in his heart, keeping our physical space peaceful was the greatest gift he could give our children. Years rolled on like gentle waves on a quiet shore, and the lessons of those early years became the invisible foundation of our daily life. Lily and Leo grew up in a home where hard conversations were welcomed with patience, where mistakes were met with guidance rather than shame, and where love was never treated as something to be earned. On a warm summer night during Lily's 8th birthday, our backyard was filled with soft fairy lights and warm laughter. Gavin stood up to say a few words, his voice thick with quiet emotion as he thanked our small circle of loved ones for being our steady shelter, speaking not of past hurts or legal papers, but only of gratitude, growth, and the quiet beauty of building a home anchored in absolute truth. Decades later, the afternoon sun beamed through the large windows of our living room as Gavin and I watched our adult children pack their cars after a long holiday weekend. Lily had recently completed her master's degree in child psychology, possessing the same quiet empathy and grounded wisdom that had carried us through our darkest hours, while Leo was thriving in his own creative endeavors. Before leaving, Lily sat with me on the porch, holding a small leather-bound journal I had kept during the trust dispute, smiling softly as she told me that reading about our journey had given her the strength to navigate her own life with dignity and self-respect. Standing on the porch, watching their cars disappear down the tree-lined drive, I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of completion. Now, in the peaceful twilight of our lives, Gavin and I spend our late afternoons walking along the quiet shoreline near our home, listening to the soft rhythm of the tide coming in. The memory of that tense evening in the restaurant and the months of legal restructuring feel like stories from another lifetime, necessary fires that refined our character and drew us closer together. Our grandchildren now play on the very same sand, their bright laughter echoing over the water without a care in the world. As the sun sets, painting the evening sky in soft hues of rose and gold, Gavin takes my hand, holding it with the same tender warmth he did decades ago, knowing we walked through the storm not with loud anger, but with quiet resolve, leaving behind a legacy of peace that would cradle our family for generations. The beach house eventually became the gathering place for every family milestone, filled with the warmth of decades of shared memories and unconditional love. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the old wooden chest in the attic with her daughter, Lily found the original blue envelope that had held her first ultrasound image on that long ago night. She brought it down to the sunroom, where Gavin and I were reading by the window, setting it softly on the tea table between us with no tears or old wounds reopened, only a quiet, unspoken appreciation for the path we had walked. Gavin picked up the faded envelope, holding it in his hands as our granddaughter crawled onto his lap, asking for a story, and he smiled softly, looking at me, and began to tell her about how true strength is never found in shouting or control, but in the quiet courage to protect love, honor the truth, and build a peaceful life that lasts forever. By evening, the rain had finally stopped, and the house was dead silent. The blue envelope was still lying wide open on the desk in our living room. That single letter had exposed every secret my mother-in-law was trying to keep hidden from us, and for the very first time, she had completely lost her control over our lives. My husband walked into the room and stood right next to me, looking at those papers. He didn't offer any fake comfort or try to make excuses for his family like he used to in the past. He just looked exhausted and angry that things had escalated to this point. We sat on the couch for hours, talking about how much damage had been caused by years of silent interference. We both knew that pretending everything was fine just to keep a fake sense of peace in the family was no longer an option, and things had to change immediately. The next morning, the tension in the house was so thick you could barely breathe. Downstairs, my mother-in-law was aggressively packing her bags, making as much noise as possible to show her frustration. She wasn't her usual arrogant, controlling self. She looked angry, bitter, and defeated because her plan to create a rift between my husband and me had completely backfired. When she finally brought her suitcases down to the hallway, my husband stepped up and confronted her directly. He kept his tone completely calm and grounded, but his words were sharp and unwavering. He told her that he loved her because she was his mother, but he would never again allow her to walk into our home to disrespect me, ruin our mental peace, or stress me out while I was pregnant with his child. She stared at him in complete shock, expecting him to back down like he always did in the past, but when she realized he was serious, she snapped her purse shut, rolled her eyes, and walked out the door without offering a single apology. Hearing that front door slam shut was the most relieving sound I had heard in years. It felt like a massive, heavy weight was lifted off my chest, but the days right after her departure weren't an instant fairy tale either. We had to deal with the messy aftermath and the awkwardness that followed. Over the next 2 weeks, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. My husband's relatives, aunties, and family friends started calling one by one, accusing us of being disrespectfully selfish and kicking an elder out of the house. My mother-in-law had already started spreading her own victim story, telling everyone that I had manipulated her son against her. Dealing with those passive-aggressive phone calls while being heavily pregnant was mentally draining. There were days when I felt completely overwhelmed and cried out of frustration, wondering if this drama would ever leave us alone. But my husband stood like a solid wall between me and his extended family. He took every single call himself, clearly telling everyone that what happened inside our marriage was none of their business, and that if anyone disrespectfully brought up my name again, he would cut them off too. Seeing him take a firm stand for me gave me a level of emotional security I had never felt before. To make sure there were no lingering doubts left between us, I decided to pull out those blue envelope documents once again on a Sunday afternoon. I sat my husband down at the dining table, and we went through every single page line by line. We discussed the money matters, the hidden legal papers, the pregnancy rumors his mother had tried to spark, and every single misunderstanding that had built up over the years. We didn't rush through it. We had some hard, painful conversations where tears were shed and uncomfortable truths were spoken, but we cleared the air completely. Once we were done, my husband took those papers to the kitchen sink, lit them with a match, and watched them burn down to black ashes. Throwing those ashes in the trash felt like burning away years of baggage that wasn't even ours to carry in the first place. With his mother out of our daily life and the family drama slowly cooling down, our main focus shifted entirely toward my health and preparing for the baby's arrival. The third trimester was physically tough on me, but my husband stepped up in ways I didn't expect. He started taking care of household chores, cooking dinners when I was too tired, coming with me to every single doctor appointment, and setting up the nursery room with me. We still had normal, everyday arguments, like arguing over baby names, managing our monthly budget, or being tired after a long day at work, because that's what real life looks like. It wasn't some perfect fantasy life, but it was honest, grounded, and ours. One afternoon, my mother-in-law tried to send a distant relative to our house to test the waters and see if we would invite her back for the baby's delivery. My husband met the relative at the door, listened politely, but clearly stated that, until his mother sincerely acknowledged her past behavior and apologized to me, she would not be part of our daily life or present in the delivery room. He didn't say it with anger, he said it with the calmness of a man who knew his priorities. By the final month of my pregnancy, our home environment had completely transformed. The constant walking on eggshells, the fear of judgment, and the toxicity were entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, steady routine where we could actually breathe and laugh without second-guessing everything. Looking back at the long, chaotic road that brought us here, I realized that saving our marriage wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about facing the hard truths, setting strict boundaries with toxic family members, and standing together when everything else was falling apart. As we sat together in our quiet living room, ready to welcome our child into a healthy, drama-free home, I knew we had built a real foundation that no outside bitterness could ever break again.